Welcome to the Beer Travelers podcast from All About Beer. I'm your host, Andy Crouch, and we'll get to our conversation about Portland's intriguing beer scene in a minute. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts. Portland, Maine is another of America's most overlooked beer scenes. Occasionally mistaken for the other beer powerhouse of the same name, the East Coast Portland plays host to a number of quintessential American craft breweries and an easily accessible beer scene that is perfect for a day trip or a longer stay. And today, we have two great local guests to guide us on our journey. Carla Lauter is a freelance beer writer based just outside of Portland. She has written columns and articles for a number of publications, and her current gig is with local Beer and Weed magazine. Carla is smart, funny, and plugged into Portland and the Maine beer scenes. She's opinionated and engaging, and when she talks, folks in the know listen. Joining Carla today is Benjamin Moore, a freelance writer and photographer in Maine. Ben is best known as the Active Beer Geek on Instagram. His photos are striking, and he captures the spirit of the beer scene in the state through the lens of his camera. I'm excited to jump into an exploration of the history and present-day treasures of the Portland, Maine beer scene on this, the new episode of Beer Travelers. Welcome to the Beer Travelers podcast from All About Beer. I'm your host, Andy Crouch. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite cities for beer. Frankly, just one of my favorite cities, period. It's the other Portland, Portland, Maine. We often hear about Portland, Oregon, and the fantastic beer scene there. Little less known is what's going on up north in Maine. This is a beer scene and a town of only about 70,000 people, right on the water with a beautiful old port. Weekends and the evenings can get a little bit rowdy downtown, but it is one of the jewels of the American beer scene. It has a lot of history, a lot of background, and it also has developed over time and evolved into a place that once was known for English-style ales and now is known for just about anything under the sun, to go along with a fantastic restaurant scene. So let's explore Portland, Maine today with two fantastic local guests. And we're going to start today with my good friend Carla Lauter, who's going to talk a little bit about the history of craft beer in the city. We have talked many, many times about, the OG players in town, whether it's Geary's and Allagash and Gritty's and Shipyard. Where do you think that, the history of beer in Portland really starts?
Well, I think you actually have to start a lot earlier than that. Is that Maine being the first state to impose prohibition
Yes.
is a big deal. We've got Neil Dow, who is considered, sometimes the father of prohibition. And that kind of put us on a path of, kind of having this odd relationship with alcohol. So they had at one point, during Prohibition, there was actually a famous event called the Portland Rum Riots, where people were convinced that there was this secret stash of liquor at the city hall, and they basically stormed City Hall trying to get at it. And there's this kind of, unique, tenuous relationship with alcohol for a long time in Maine's history. So when, D.L. Geary came in and did, his first brewery opened in 1983, or incorporated in 1983, opened in 1986, one of the earliest breweries in the whole country, really, in that kind of Sam Adams era. It was kind of a surprise. People had to kind of rewrite the history of Portland to kind of accept this new alcohol. There's even an article that I found once from the old history, from the archives that says, it shall be a surprise if Portland ever has any breweries, and suddenly now it's this, this hub of what's going on in New England beer. And so it has evolved, but I think that laying those foundations through Geary Brewing, that kind of in the 80s, and a couple of others that came right after, Gritty's Shipyard, and even in the 90s, Sebago, kind of laid the groundwork for, okay, we can do this in a way that isn't harmful. This is not, going to be, it was a testing the waters, really, of can we do this in a good way? And I think that those successes, those kind of pioneers pushing that through, they were publicans, they were, everybody knew who they were. Everybody knew the top, nothing bad happened, that they were kind of allowed to kind of create that that on-ramp for what happened in the earlier 2000s, which it really kicked off our beer boom.
Yeah, and there's these just big names, David Geary and Alan Pugsley, Rob Todd, to some of the publicans and writers, Alan Eames. For Ben, what is your sort of relationship with the history of beer in Portland, and the sort of some of these founding figures?
The brands are certainly they paved the way for what we see now, and it's an interesting thing that people have turned away from the styles, but the breweries are still there, and the history and the groundwork has been laid years ago for what we see now. But actually, I just looked up. It's funny. Wikipedia says in 1983, Geary's was one of 13 microbreweries in the entire United States.
Yeah, really early days.
And you referenced the style, and that's what I think one of the interesting things here, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, is that Portland really did have a defining style of flavor of beer. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I was talking to an owner of a more modern brewery, opened about 11 years ago, and I won't say who. I don't, but he was talking that maybe 15 years ago, if you were talking about Portland, Maine, people say like you went to CBC and you went to talk about Portland, Maine, they'd be like, oh, the English beers that taste very like off flavor. Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have nothing to offer the beer industry at the moment. And now it's a very well sought after destination that people come up here just for beer vacations. Not too far after that. And I feel like you needed that traditional English style to then propel what we see now. The Ringwood yeast, those styles, the Alan Pugsley systems, those paved the way for now people wanting to branch off and try different styles, hazy IPAs, New England IPAs, things like that. So yeah, it's interesting. That I wish I would have been in the beer industry 15 years ago to see people's reactions of like, oh, something's happened in Portland, Maine, and everybody else in the United States is like, sure, yeah, cool, I guess.
And I'll add to that if I can. The other thing there, which is kind of cool, is that even that English style, those ales were reactionary to what was being brewed in the US at the time, which is primarily lagers. So like it was kind of like, hey, we want to go back to brewing something more flavorful or something, kind of with body, as opposed to what had become the national dominant thing. And I think that really encompasses the whole craft beer movement, right? Is that we didn't want to drink the same mm-hmm. thing. We wanted to have some creativity there, and bringing over what was already working in Europe, that was not lager based, was a really good strategy. And that just really disrupted, kind of the beer style scene at the time. And then further that, Rob Todd disrupted it a little bit more by bringing in the Belgian style, with Allagash, debuting Allagash White really early on. Pouring it at the Great Lost Bear, as one of the first places it was poured. And so, but that, again, it kind of broke the mold of what styles were out there. And then, kind of after that point, I feel like after Allagash kind of opened, Pandora's box of, oh, beer can taste like mm-hmm. all these things. Let's get as creative as we can.
We've talked about a number of different names here, and I think it's important to go back and talk about them in a little bit more detail. Obviously, David Geary, in starting his place was one of the earliest east of the Mississippi. But the defining characteristic is one, as we've talked about, is one of this yeast style called Ringwood. And it's, an English, derivative yeast that was really brought to the United States and publicized by an individual by the name of Alan Pugsley, who then went on to, he assisted, DL in opening Geary's and ran that for a few years before there was a falling out. And then eventually went on to, start up Shipyard with a partner. And his flavor, for those who don't know, this is, uncharitably can be called popcorn or butter. It typically focuses more on a diacetyl as a net positive. It's just a very strongly charactered English style yeast that comes with a very particular type of open fermenting, brewing system. And Alan Pugsley also kind of was the Johnny Appleseed of Ringwood throughout New England and up and down the East Coast. I mean, all the way back to Dogfish Head's first, was a Ringwood brewery back in its earliest days. And his influence on the scene has been incredible. And we'll certainly talk about Rob Todd and Allagash plenty here, but But Carla, tell us a little bit more just sort of about, Alan Pugsley and the role Shipyard has played in the history of craft beer and brewing in Portland.
I think there's a lot up to say about that, kind of defining what a beer flavor should be. So again, in an audience where you've really primarily been confronted with the really, crisp, dry, very light-bodied lagers,
Mm-hmm.
basically teaching the audience that there are certain flavors that go beyond that. So a really good brown ale. Shipyard has a I get this, I think they still make it. Shipyard has a beer called Export, which again, like by itself, an excellent example of like the really traditional English styles. And like it became incredibly popular because it was like an everyman's drink, but also just had more flavor to it, more going on. The detractors from that kind of Ringwood flavor argue that in some instances, basically there's too much of that diacetyl note.
Yeah.
There's too much of the butter. It's a little too oily, kind of a mouthfeel. And there's, it can be argued either way. Is it really too much, or are we just, walking away from, our tastes are changing for those styles? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's kind of gotten amplified over time a little bit with that Ringwood yeast, but also at the same time, our flavors, people have gotten much more into the bitterness of hops, the kind of dry hopping things, and taking them in new flavor directions. But I think that you can see the systems, you can still see the systems that Pugsley set up all over New England. They have like little plaques on their on their big open top fermenters, at breweries across, the Northeast. And it's still a thing, and it's still a thing that can be done well. It's just for 2023, it's a little bit out of fashion. It doesn't make it bad. But it really did kind of like set the tone for this is what can be possible in beer styles. And it's why you see like the brew pubs of the 90s. They all had a pale ale, a brown ale, an amber ale, because that was the archetype. That was what you set up, and it became the template that would lead to the experimentation later on.
And Ben, we've name checked Rob Todd and Allagash, and this is sort of an obvious question, but what has Allagash meant to the city of Portland? Can it be characterized?
I think Allagash has been many things to Portland over the years, and now it's sort of like the North Star. Like when it does something, it kind of leads the way in Portland quite a bit, and perhaps the country. But back in the day, they've endured when Maine only had 20 breweries, and now they have 120 breweries in the state. So they've endured with a real consistent brand and a real positive attitude towards the whole industry, while kind of having that upwards the hill to walk up on that was hard to sell that style of beer when they first released. Which I would love to see a podcast with maybe Peter Bissell and Rob Todd on to be like, so we both tried to sell hazy beers when no one liked hazy beers.
Yeah.
And just their uphill battles that they had to do in sales wise would be a fascinating thing to hear. But yeah, I feel like without Rob Todd and Allagash, and he's such a humble dude. When you really meet him, he's, the dress like he owns a crazy big company that everybody's heard of, and or beer that everybody loves. And they do a lot for the community.
And it's a pretty entertaining situation that just proximity wise, almost all of this brewing that we're talking about, especially in the early days, happened within maybe a half a mile of one another on this one street called Industrial Way in Portland. And I don't know at its peak how many different breweries it has had on that street, but the street is not, like I said, not very long, but it's maybe 6 or 8.
I think it's seven now. Yeah.
So Carla, tell us about Industrial Way.
So Industrial Way, is what it sounds like. It's kind of like this mixed use industrial park type area where, they have office space, they have warehouses, they have, nobody would ever go there unless you needed to, pick up a package or something. But Allagash put down their brewery there. And also DL Geary's is around the corner in that same area. And that, originally, the tasting rooms were not a thing. People did not go to visit these places. They were production facilities only. And actually Geary's didn't have a tasting room until I think maybe 6-7 years ago. They were not into the idea of people coming and visiting their brewery. But Allagash did. They opened a small tasting room. You got free samples at the end of your tour, right? So then it became this is a process that you can come and see. So that area being inexpensive, relatively speaking, for kind of industrial equipped spaces with, floor drains or big doors that you could put equipment in, kind of, I think, opened, the eyes of the newer brewers that came in, in the early 2000s going, oh, I need a space, but I don't want to build from scratch. Where do I put something like this? I'll put it in a bay of an industrial thing. So Maine Beer Company started in that area. After they moved out, Bissell Brothers took over their space. Rising Tide started behind that building. And they eventually got their own space in another place. Austin Street's still there. There's Definitive is there. Battery Steel is now there. Foundation is on the other side and has now expanded into where Bissell used to be. It's basically, you could spend an entire day in Portland and never leave Industrial Way. My only complaint being that the parking is awful,
right?
But it became this little like nursery neighborhood for new breweries to get started until they could, get a second facility or get somewhere bigger. And Allagash, going back to Allagash, they would help them out. These little breweries in, the early 2000s. Oh, I got a bag of unmilled grain and I don't have a, mill, bring it over. We'll mill it at our place. Or, oh, do you need to borrow a forklift? Oh, we'll drive it over. There was this very not competitive, but community, like Ben said, community spirit that I think Allagash played a big part in kind of setting up that second wave generation of brewery success. And I think that that's continued. Now, Allagash has just announced that they're building a new facility that's going to focus on basically the tasting experience kind of for people to visit that is not in Industrial Way, because essentially it's exceeding their ability to handle the amount of people that want to come. So I think that's a great move for them. It's still a couple of years out, but they have announced that. But I think they're still going to continue. They are still going to continue to do the production there. They're probably going to do more barrel aging if they have more space to do that. And I'm pretty excited to see that happen. But that might fundamentally change a little bit about, kind of how that Industrial Way area is experienced, as a beer drinker. But
one of the things that Carla referenced earlier is a bar called the Great Lost Bear. And if we're talking sort of history in Portland, the Bear is you talk to any of these first, second, third wave brewers, that's where, that's the bar in town that put, craft beer on early and was an early supporter of places like Allagash and Geary's and Shipyard and things like that. Ben, can you talk a little bit, and I'll have Carla weigh in as well. Talk about, the role the Great Lost Bear has played in the development of craft beer and sort of what it has also meant to the city of Portland.
Absolutely. Great Lost Bear arguably is the first craft beer bar in Portland. I don't know of anyone that started before them. In 1979 is when they opened. And yeah, it's been sort of a North Star of the craft beer industry in terms of the retail bar sort of area. I think a lot of breweries have poured their first beer at Great Lost Bear, including some of the ones we're talking about. And it's just one of those bars that you feel like will never go away and has all the tchotchkes on the wall that doesn't feel Ruby Tuesdays or something. I don't know. It's got a vibe that you can't really describe. It's the bar is this big U-shaped bar that's very communal, and you can meet anybody at the bar from any walks of life. There's about, I think, 50 taps of various beers throughout the state. They have an Allagash corner that they just have Allagash beers on tap. It's a fascinating bar. It's one of those places that I think I've had the same chicken sandwich since I was 10 years old there. And it's tasted the same. And honestly, I can't argue that that's one of my favorite things to get in town. It's consistent. It's great. But yeah, I feel like there's been a lot of breweries that they've taken a chance on, and they've said, yeah, we'll pour your beer. If no one else is buying it, great. We'll buy it. We'll put it on.
Yeah. It's one of those, it's very much a 1980s, 1990s style beer bar. And it as anybody who has ever been to one, you could picture it. This is that place. But Carla, tell us about the Great Lost Bear.
Yeah, and I think I recently wrote a column about the Great Lost Bear, and I think I used the phrase, "It has never suffered a bar rescue makeover." You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like nothing has changed since the day that thing is open. But what I think what's been core to the Great Lost Bear's success too is that not only are they just pouring, it's basically one of the places that you can probably get the most variety of Maine brewed beer in one place, if not the uh, biggest selection of Maine beer, but also every Thursday night forever. They have been doing like a showcase of one brewery at a time.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, Thursday's Sebago night. Next Thursday's, whatever the next brewery is. And they'll have a special on the beers, so they're cheaper. It's like a happy hour kind of thing. And you go, and usually the brewer's there, or somebody who works there to answer questions or just hang out, and they're like kind of buying you beers as they go. And it's just like, hey, it's like a meet the brewer night every week, which is, connecting people to the beer scene, who maybe, wouldn't be going, up to Bangor to go to Orono Brewing Company, by themselves, but hey, they can have 3 or 4 of their beers on tap, chat with the owners. Like that's a total experience in and of itself. And their food is delicious. They have great wings. They have a dessert that's called cake in a jar that I order every time I'm there. And it's just one of those things that, like, you would think that by now, something would have, some quality, something would have changed, but no, nothing has changed. And that's an excellent, excellent thing. I'm excited that nothing has changed. And it's one of the few places I go in and I go, because it's not different. Yeah.
Yeah. No, we see so much change. And I wrote a book, almost 15 years ago now, called The Good Beer Guide to New England. And in that book, I focused, on some great beer bars, and the Great Lost Bear was one of them. And this is a classic place. But as Carla says, you walk back in there, as Ben noted, like when he's 10 years old, like you walk in there, this place is the exact same. It has not changed. It is what it is. And there's something, to be said with, all the advancements in tap rooms and all the new opportunities for breweries to sell their beer to the public. It's nice to have that kind of throwback place, a place that's been open since, I think, 1979, that just has so much history in it and has never, wavered since, I think, the earliest days it served, Geary's beer, as some of the first craft beer it served, from that mission of supporting and promoting, Maine craft beer. And so if you're in town, I definitely recommend coming by for a pint and a chicken sandwich and then some cake in a jar. So yeah. There are some other fantastic bars in Portland. We're going to talk a lot about those. But before we get into sort of this next round here, we'll just take a quick break here and have a message from our sponsors. We'll be right back. Want more beer for your ears? The new All About Beer podcast, hosted by M. Sauter and Don Tess, takes a deep, engaging dive into the hottest topics in beer. Do you need to know what the heck a cold IPA is? Check out the first episode wherever you get your pods. New episodes drop every other Thursday. And now, back to Beer Travelers. We are back with the Portland, Maine episode of Beer Travelers. And today, now we're going to get into what we call a rapid fire lightning round. It's quick questions, off the cuff answers, sort of the first things that come to your mind. And then we quickly devolve from this format and just start, going off on our own tangents. And this is just what happens. So we'll see, where this goes. So let's start with Carla. And where do we want to start? There's a lot of different places in Portland making a lot of different kinds of beer. Sometimes you have a city that's all IPA or all mainly lager. Portland is one of those towns that does quite a bit. So let's start with this area. What would you say, Carla, are the top 3 breweries that you're going to go to for sour or mixed fermentation beer?
Well, Allagash is the first. So that's
a controversial take.
It is. Well, it's funny because that's always the first take. Is everybody's like, well, Allagash and then you just you just keep talking. I would say that there are a few breweries that are doing some really good kettle sour stuff, and I used to not like that because it was kind of everywhere. But I would say that Bandit has a sour program that's really good, and so does Oxbow. Oxbow does a lot of mixed firm, interesting barrel aging. But if you want like that kind of kettle sour tartness, I'm a go-to for Bandit on that, because they know what they're doing and they always come out good. It's not kind of a roulette with, I don't know if it's going to come out good. Ben may disagree with me on that though, because I am a less of a kettle sour gal than I am a, kind of store it in a cellar and make it funky forever sour gal. So.
Ben, what's your take?
Allagash and
Eventually we'll get to
'cause-
IPA, even though Allagash has an IPA now. I don't know that they'll come in top. So maybe for one of these, we'll say not Allagash and.
Yeah.
I was gonna say Allagash if you asked me IPA, just because I just had their hop reach and it's been actually very good. And they told me the story of how they that recipe. But so to answer the kettle sour mixed fermentation question, Allagash for sure, Oxbow for sure. Just history wise, they've been doing kettle sours, mixed ferm, cool ship. Even even Oxbow's been doing cool ships up in Newcastle. So those guys have sort of had a good pedigree. And man, sour beers, I'm kind of off the sour beer train. So I'm kind of like, if it's not like an Allagash cool ship sort of sour, like a real rare thing, it's like in a can, like a kettle sour. I used to love Four River. Their Preble series was good. And they would rotate those flavors quite a bit.
And unfortunately, they're not with us any longer. So that's a sad one to lose. Yeah.
Yes. They had a really good cranberry, and occasionally they would do a strawberry rhubarb.
I'll give a mention too to Foundation as well. They've come out with a couple called the Such and Such Fruit is My Jam series that are really good. Some of them have been excellent. They've done all kinds of fruit, everything from the typical raspberry whatever to like things like guava, and they've been very, very interesting. They rotate all the time though, so like I can't point to one that's like my favorite, but they've been doing that for a couple of years now, and I think that was a nice compliment. I went to the Foundation's anniversary the other day, and they said, we started off saying, oh yeah, we're gonna do all Belgian styles, and they never did, which I thought was fun.
Yeah, that is you don't see a lot of Belgian themed or focused breweries opening up.
Right.
You're right about now. Hopefully that'll change again at some point. But Ben, we'll get to you for this one, and it's kind of the big one. It's, what are your top 3 local breweries for IPAs, for hopheads, for haze? Those may be 3 separate categories, but apparently this is going to be a hot take if Allagash is making this list. I'm curious to see where you go.
I'd say it would be fair for the hopheads to separate the hazy from the non-hazy, just because for me, those are very 2 different categories of IPAs in terms of how I taste them and how I experience them. But I would say for the not hazy category, the hop reach from Allagash, fantastic beer. They told me that the story behind that was they basically would do these long bracketed sort of tournament style, like with the employees to see like what they would like blind tasting wise until they got to the final bracket. And that's what was hop reach essentially. So they went through a very extensive research and development process for that. And it's a nice solid beer. It's great. And it's sort of in the same category in my head as like Maine Beer Company, where it's nice. It doesn't have that West Coast, but it has that. It leans towards that. It's clear. It's balanced. It's nice. And then another IPA that's not hazy would probably have to be. Now I'm kind of trying to find them in my brain where to say, because everybody else is hazy right now. If I had to have a beer that wasn't, I don't know.
This is the generational difference between the two of us. I can list you off 10 not hazy beers. And
then we can shift. Ben can just shift into haze if he wants to. We can hit Carla up for West Coast.
Just do all the haze. Just do all the haze, and I'll do all the not haze.
Hey, an honorable mention would be Geary's HSA for non-hazy IPAs, just because it was such a revolutionary IPA back in the day. When like no one was really doing that kind of stuff. But anyway,
these are the hottest takes the show has ever seen. And for folks who don't understand which we're dropping these things like Geary's HSA. Like, Ben, what is HSA?
Hampshire Special Ale. I think it's an IPA. It's very hoppy. It kind of came out, I want to say like in the 90s, maybe early 90s. And it was kind of in a time where no one was really doing that kind of stuff. And it was a higher ABV, higher bitterness, big beer that sort of like was on its own in a state where like everybody was sort of doing lagers, or for Allagash's sake, Belgian wit beer. So it's an interesting beer back in the day. And even if you have it now, you're like, oh, it's refreshing, not hazy, West Coasty IPA.
And for them, for Geary's, this is one of those classic beers in the canon of Maine history. It's the HSA was they brewed it, and the tagline used to be, though I think DL eventually soured on this, was they brewed it when the weather sucks. And it may be because a lot of Maine's weather sucks. I'm sorry for it's beautiful a lot of the time of the year, but very, very, very cold other times and a little gray.
get some mud season in there. But they now make it on a year-round basis, and it was that classic, English style pale, typical crystal malts, some, Cascade, East Kent Golding kind of hops, it was a very, very well balanced Ringwood beer. But it also had some toasted notes in there. It was a beautiful, this is a beautiful, now I guess it's kind of a throwback kind of IPA, but at the time it was kind of leading edge here. But go ahead.
No, I'm looking at the website right now. It says Maine's original winter warmer, which I'm sure it is. 7% ABV was back then was probably a super high ABV beer because you weren't doing. I would say there wasn't anything in the middle. You'd have like your styles that had to be in these ABV categories, and there wasn't anything in the middle range where it was like not 5% but not 10%, and this was like right in the middle at 7%, and it wasn't like a style you would expect at 7%. So I would, from what I was hearing from my beer geeks who are older friends, they were saying, HSA was one of those beers that like you kind of didn't know what to do with and you loved at the same time.
Yeah, that is well put. I don't know if we hit 3 there or not, but I think we might have. So Carla, let's talk to, actually do we even get you through all of them? We didn't even mention Bissell in the IPA category. This is interesting.
I wanted to throw back to Ben. When people come and visit Portland, and I know they ask you all the time, where are the 3 breweries that you send them for hazies? What is your top hazies? Like breweries, like where do you go where you just know that they're going to get hazies, they're going to be happy at the end of the day?
Bissell, Definitive, and right now Bellflower.
Yep. I would agree with that. Bellflowers are relatively new, and I think they're like 2-3 years old, and they're doing some great beer. They're kicking butt.
So these are breweries we haven't really talked about. Ben, just walk us through, and we'll, I imagine we'll talk about Bissell a lot. It has not come up as much as I thought it might have, because now we're promoting Allagash's IPAs, which I would never in a million years have thought we were going to talk about, and as much as HSA. But tell us about, Bellflower. I think you mentioned Definitive, and talk us through those two, because I'm sure we'll talk Bissell again.
Definitive is fantastic. They're in the Industrial Parkway, across the street from Allagash, not in the original sort of pod building, but they have another industrial park building there. They have a couple locations. They've been opening up locations like crazy in the last couple of years, which is great, but they are known for opening their brewery with a Kolsch and a session IPA and a really good hazy IPA. And they've kind of evolved their hazy, and basically now you see a lot of their rotating beers either be hazy IPAs or kettle sours with different flavors. They're really good at that, and their kettle sours range from different viscosities, if you will. But their IPAs are fantastic. Their Kolsch is probably one of the best Kolsch's I would say in the state. And then when you go to Bellflower, it's the former Brewery Extrava. So you were saying that you wish that more breweries would open up with Belgian beers as their focus, and Brewery Extrava tried to do that a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, they did not succeed. I still have a couple of their quads in my fridge, some of my favorite beer I've ever had. But Bellflower took over that space, and the pedigree of brewing came from Trillium and Lone Pine, is the owners, worked there for a long time before opening up Bellflower. And they're known for their just sort of doing really solid styles, including their hazy IPAs, which have been quite a bit rotating lately. And they nail every style, from my opinion. Like when they brew something, it's pretty good.
Carla, what do you have to add in terms of IPAs? Do you want to hit the?
Yeah, I want to hit the not hazy side. So if you're like me and you got attached to the West Coast IPAs and can't quite get your head around loving the haze, I would say, I know it's not technically in Portland, but Maine Beer Company is still at the top of that list. They make excellent beer, and most of it is of an IPA bent. Some of it's West Coast style, some of it's more kind of classical, but they're all excellent and impeccable, and you'll never get one that disappoints you. It's just their quality standards are insane. And then I would also add to that, both Rising Tide and Banded Brewing make excellent, kind of really that piney, resinous, the stuff that we remember from 10 years ago. Awesome, West Coast style IPAs. Bandit has this beer called Viridian, which it's just sappy and sticky and wonderful. Rising Tide has one called Cutter, which they name a lot of their stuff after nautical things, so it's like a type of boat, and it comes out periodically. It's excellent. But they also have a year-round beer called Maine Island Trail Ale, which is like a pale ale, but it's nice and hoppy, but not being that kind of hazy hop profile. It's just very, very easy drinking. They just last year changed that to being a year-round beer, which made me very excited, because they used to like have it like basically from April through the summer only, and it became like the beer you had to like stock your fridge with all summer. But it's just a great easy drinker. But both Bandit and Rising Tide, brew periodically different IPA styles, and they don't really do the hazy thing often. Like they'll do like one or two, but if you're looking for that kind of like really bitter, good, kind of West Coast style, that's typically where I'll send people within Portland for that. Foundation's good at them too, but they also have hazy, so it's kind of like, but I would say Rising Tide and Bandit kind of lean more in the non-hazy direction.
We haven't really gotten too much into Bissell, so they sort of are kind of a category onto themselves. I don't know if they're the third wave or the fourth wave of breweries in Portland. But Ben, tell me, talk a little bit about, Bissell and its role in the Portland beer scene.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you said wave, I kind of want to figure out what the waves were in Portland and who was on the three waves.
I think that's third wave, because the first wave is like Geary, right? And the second wave was like all the 90s brew pubs. And then the third wave was like Rising Tide, Bissell, Maine Beer, like that early 2000s group. And then like we're in the fourth wave now, which is like hazy explodey land that was in the last 5 years. So I feel like that's third wave. If I had to argue that, I feel like this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying like the craft beer boom in Portland is really the third one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Go ahead, Ben. About the Bissell.
I was about to literally say, like, let's define what those are. You did it perfectly. Yeah, Bissell they're a different category. They're a category of their own. I'm just trying to put words into it. They were known for their IPAs for the longest time, and are still, obviously. I've seen 1,000 people wait in line for their Swish IPA in their old location before. So they're certainly known for their hazy single and double IPAs, sometimes triples. And yeah, they started in industrial way, just like a lot of breweries that we were talking about today did. And they were only brewing a few styles: their Substance IPA, their Swish double IPA once in a while, their summer IPAs, and they would branch out. See, now when you go to the brewery, they have definitely one of everything in a lot of ways, because they don't just focus on their IPAs, although they have predominantly IPAs on tap. But you'll see Baltic porters, you'll see Pilsners, lagers. They're having a Kolsch soon. So they've definitely branched out, and the styles that they brew, they definitely hit them on the mark. It's one of those breweries that you would expect would only be good at one thing, but when you try everything else, you're like, oh, you actually nail everything that you do, not just the one thing that we all know you for. And that's fantastic to see in a day and age where everybody's just like, oh yeah, I want to stand in line for hazy IPAs. And you're like, yeah, but have you tried the Baltic Porter?
Yeah. And it seems like Bissell also is taken a little bit of a nod and some advice from the leadership that Allagash has played in the local community. Bissell seems to have done, this is from someone who is at a bit of a remove from the town, but they seem to be an important partner in the community, ones that are trying to also encourage other breweries as well as being just involved in community affairs. I saw that in the local baseball team, they now have a giant inflatable Substance can that is an advertisement out in the outfield. But they always seem to be doing, pretty good stuff, and to be pretty good stewards there as well.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I want to echo too what Ben says about that kind of, they got known for, kind of being the disruptors. They were one of the first really breweries, if not the first, to focus on hazies when they got out the gate. But their diversification of their lineup is excellent. And I keep telling people, like, if you haven't been to Bissell for a while, or even if hazies are not your thing, you need to go back over there, because they're making some excellent beer. And not that they weren't making excellent beer before, but they're making excellent beer outside of their wheelhouse, what I would have considered their wheelhouse. But yeah, it is a lot of that. They helped a lot of breweries figure out distribution. They helped a lot of people kind of solve problems that they came across first, because again, they were in that little earlier wave. And they, have been very supportive of the beer industry as a whole. They're very participatory in all of the Maine Brewers Guild stuff. Like they really want the industry as a whole to succeed, because it's it helps everybody when that happens.
Uh, Carla, let's talk about lager. Near and dear to both of our hearts. Where are
Yep.
3 places that you're going for lager?
Bunker tops that list for me because it's funny, they never get mentioned in like the top, breweries to go visit, but they make some really excellent beer and they're just hidden behind this little warehouse thing. Nobody ever goes there, but I think they have some excellent lager, like their Machine Pills is really good.
We get that all over Boston now. I don't have any idea why, and it's always what I'm reaching for.
It's
I
super
love
good.
seeing that beer.
It's super good. Also, if we've had the one that people have probably heard of, we have Sacred Profane, which is down in Biddeford. It's not technically in Portland, but they're focusing on just 2 styles of lager. So, it's kind of like that's their whole wheelhouse. It's an interesting business model, and I think that it's kind of in that kind of McSorley's vein, but without being so without being as casual as that.
Yeah.
Kind of having a light, having a dark, but trying to do those 2 as best as you can. And both beers are quite good. And then from there, a lot of the breweries recently, just in general, all over Portland, have expanded into making lagers, and they're doing a decent job. And it's kind of keeps surprising me, and it shouldn't. But like Foundation Brewing Company has a couple of German style lagers that they pour, from the Czech side tap and stuff. They're great, and it's kind of been a fun little treasure hunt to see who's doing lagers well, because they're starting to add them into their lineup next to their typical beers. So I'm not sure that I would say other than what do you call it, Sacred Profane, that there's too many breweries that are really focused on lagers, maybe other than New Brewery up in the middle of nowhere in New Gloucester, but the fact that like you can kind of find good ones throughout the city is really encouraging. And I've been, very, very pleased with how well they've come out, because they're tricky to brew. And I've had, not good lagers before, but I think that people have, had enough time to kind of dial that in, that it's been kind of exciting to find them where you find them, kind of among these breweries that you wouldn't necessarily call any of them a lager brewery. If that makes sense.
Ben, what are your thoughts? Any additions for any breweries to visit for lager in Portland?
I think Carla's got a good point. I wish the lager category was as notorious as like a hazy IPA category, where people were known for that style. And I would say Sacred Profane is the only one that's known for just lagers in Maine right now. I would think maybe other people are known for their lager, or a couple of their lagers, but not like they're known for just doing lagers as like a reputation. And Sacred Profane has been absolutely crushing it. I pretty much always have their dark lager in my fridge at all times. And I feel like Carla's right when it comes to lagers. It's basically everybody's kind of starting to make one, and it's not a hit or miss, but you can tell who's nailing it, who's doing it well, and who's just really, really nailing it well. I think everybody's got a lager on tap at this point, and I'm really happy about it.
And Ben, just sort of move into a different category. What is a one can't miss beer bar in Portland?
Can't miss beer bar. Navarre? Is this a trick question, or is this?
Well, this is the question, because I think it's such a fantastic drinking city, and obviously Great Lost Bear is a place with tremendous history, and a place that I think we maybe have touched upon a little bit. $3 Dewey's with a bunch of history in the city, but these are much older generation kind of beer bars. I think even before any of our times, and Navarre is kind of this centralized place. But we'll ask Carla to go beyond Navarre in the next question here. But Ben, tell us about Navarre and its role in the local scene.
That's a big question. Well, I suppose it's a big answer. So Navarre started in 2008, and it was at the time one of the only bars doing pretty exclusively Belgian styles and international styles from Germany and Czech and other places. And you just didn't see that around town. And at the time, no one was really focusing on, basically you had the $3 Dewey's and the Great Lost Bears, and then you had Navarre. And there weren't any in-betweens at the time. And Navarre was like so not pouring local beers originally, and so focusing on imports, that everybody was like, oh, wow, like this is totally different than what everybody's doing. Nowadays, they kind of split their tap lists up 50-50. You have a lot of locals, you have a lot of import beers. Same thing. One of the only bars you can really get a good, solid like Belgian beer on tap or German beer on tap. But also you can see some local beers highlight, and they are kind of picky. You know, they do have a high quality standard, but it's this bar that you walk into, and it's in the basement. It's kind of grungy a little bit, but that kind of it
Yeah.
kind of adds to the allure of everything. There's this like chalice room where you can uh, basically get your list. You buy a list. The list has 230 beers, which range from different countries and styles. So you kind of go through an exploration of different, basically beer throughout the world in one bar. And once you finish that chalice list, you get this, this margarita looking glass, but it's still special because you went through the whole process to get it.
And speaking of someone who I know has such a glass, Carla, tell us about your relationship with Novari.
Ask Ben how many glasses he has.
I went through the list twice and I'm on my third one.
Oh, Jesus. You two are nuts. And
Yeah.
it's Carla, explain what this means.
Yeah, so it's what I like about this program, there's a lot of places where you can get like a mug club, right? You can, if you drink X number of beers, they put your name in a mug and they put it on the ceiling. But what Ben was saying is that what was different about this is that it's a prescribed list that goes through all of these different beer styles. So it's kind of forcing you to have a beer education. You can't skip the sours if you don't like sours. You can't avoid a Rausch beer. You can't, if you don't like hops, too bad. You've got a section on, that's very hoppy. And I think that especially with a growing interest in craft beer coming along with that third wave of breweries, they kind of filled this niche of like educating people to prepare them for these styles and give them the best examples of those styles that they could find. So you're not going to a bar and getting a mediocre IPA and going, oh, I hate all IPAs, right? You're going to a bar and getting, 3 of the best, IPAs that are brewed that they can get their hands on. And if you don't like that, then maybe you don't like IPAs, right? So it's a really kind of an interesting process. But yes, I did finish mine during the pandemic. I don't know, but that's really fun, and it's something too that now there's this camaraderie that you've all gone through this and done this. I enjoy that they put a lot of local beer on it as well as the imports. So there's oftentimes beer that I can't get at other bars are always on at Novari. So I always enjoy going in there because I know there's something I haven't had, and that sounds so like, beer ticker, but like I look at that list and I'm always like, oh, I want that and that and that, and I've never had any of those. So it makes me happy to walk in there, and it's just such a community vibe. Everybody's, the bartenders will know you after a couple stops in. There's some really, great regulars that are always there. I always end up talking to strangers while I'm there, and have some excellent conversation. You can just sidle up to the bar and like literally talk to anybody. It's just one of those bars that has that awesome vibe. I think it's been very important to the Portland beer scene as kind of like the central meeting place for a lot of like beer nerding things.
Yeah, I think that is a good way to put it. It really is kind of that central meeting spot. In addition to, as Ben mentioned, the kind of subterranean, a little bit dark, a little bit, not quite seedy, but just is kind of got an interesting interior vibe. It has a massive outdoor like patio as well. That is fantastic. It actually does, when Portland does have sun, you can catch a little bit of sun out there. And it's just kind of right in the center of the Old Port neighborhood, the kind of downtown touristy area of Portland. It's a fantastic place. But I'll ask Carla, beyond Novari, what are some other, maybe not necessarily beer bars, but places that you can get great beer, especially if you're in the Old Port, which is probably where you are, if you're visiting Portland.
Couple come to mind right away. Kind of in that same area that Novari is in is the Thirsty Pig, which is an establishment that's run by somebody who's also very heavily involved in the Brewers Guild. So similar to the way that the Great Lost Bear has taken on, showcasing breweries or bringing in new breweries. A lot of new breweries will do like a little launch event there. So like when they first open, that's where you can get their first beer. They'll have a little party, and they'll, it'll be the first time you've ever met them. I've seen a million new brewers. I've met them at the Thirsty Pig, and it's a smallish bar. It has a deck out back, so again, we take advantage of our summers whenever we can. But they do like basically sausages, and they have a small tap list of beer, but everything on there is really well curated. But they'll have back when they used to do kind of Maine Beer Week and things of that nature, they would have events there. The Maine Brewers Guild holds events there. And even like when we had the craft malt conference come in, they had an event where they brought in a whole bunch of different beers that were featured by, people who are grain producers from all over the place. So it's just a really cool local hangout. Very small. They have a lot of live music, so can be crowded in there, but it's really worth it. It's a fun vibe. I would also add the King's Head, which is more close down to the water. They kind of also have that Novare bent of they wanted to bring in a lot of import beer that people weren't really drinking and say, hey, look, there's this excellent German beer, there's excellent Belgian beer, like you guys should be, kind of experiencing that. They've of course mixed that with, the craft, but they have a similar program where you can go through and kind of drink through, those styles and whatnot. But I like that bar because that again is another U-shaped bar. And everybody is cross-talking in there and having a good time. And the servers really know what they're talking about. They serve the beer really well. It's always taken care of. The tap lines are super clean. Like it's one of those bars where you can tell that they care about the beer that they're serving you, which, in days where, beer bars are a dime a dozen, that matters. And they're just really great, friendly. And then total opposite of that, well, not for the cleanliness, but just total opposite of the vibe is the zoo, the Portland Zoo. So this is near Rising Tide and that kind of what they call the East Bayside area. There was a brewery. It didn't happen as a brewery. The building sat abandoned for a couple of years. Somebody bought the building. And now it is a kind of nomad brewery / beer garden. And it's really the only kind of beer garden-ish thing that Portland has. So you basically go down this little alleyway. There's like a little shed that you can order the beer in. And then it's just tables, most of which are outside or just under an eave. They have bands that play. Families are in there. People are running around. But what that bar is to me is that's where like the locals end up when we don't want to go to the places that all the tourists have swamped. Yeah. And it's just it's a totally different laid back, like nobody knows your name. Nobody cares who you are. Nobody cares, what brewery you just, got off shift at. You're all just sitting around drinking. And they have a couple of beers that they've brewed. I believe they brewed some at Baxter and a couple of other places where they're kind of doing a shared brew space type deal. They don't have their own like brewing facility, but the beers they're solid. They're just, there's a, there's a hoppy one and a not hoppy one and it's good. And it's just kind of like a very casual, like don't take yourself too seriously kind of place. And I would recommend that to folks coming in, especially in the summer when you can sit outside, listen to some music, just chill out. It's a good place to be.
Ben, what do you think is one great place that doesn't get enough attention or has been kind of flying under the radar, maybe even a place that deserves a second look?
For a beer bar, it's hard for a beer bar because the beer bars are kind of established in Portland. There's not a lot of new ones, not a lot of places that are sort of underground. There's bars in general that I like to hang out at that have great vibes that happen to have good beer, not a ton on tap, but like Maps is a great place.
Maps is a good one.
Their new renovation is amazing. It looks so nice in there right now. It's got a cool vibe because it's very small and there's literally maps all along the walls and ceilings and everything. And it's a place that used to be owned by music people, who I think one of them was like the clothing manager for Mumford & Sons or something. They worked for crazy musicians and they sold it to somebody else later on, but the vibe is still there. There's always sometimes cake on the bar that they make homemade. I don't know if they still do that anymore. It used to be delicious.
That's a cake bar?
That's one of my...
That sounds good.
It's a cake bar.
Well, they're actually known for their grilled cheeses.
Even better.
So it's definitely a fun place to go to. Low lit for sure. Good beer, but another place that's sort of... I like 3 of Strong.
Oh, I haven't been there much. Yeah.
I like that place a lot. It's a cool area. If you're jumping around from Rising Tide to Lone Pine or Bellflower, you can always stop there in between, and it's kind of a refreshing, between your brewery hops, you can go to a place that doesn't have beer, that just has rum, and you can have some really nice drinks.
Carla, what about you? What about a brewery that maybe deserves a second look or is flying under the radar, doesn't get enough attention, someplace that you may want to shout out?
Yep, I say this all the time. Sebago. So Sebago is they opened in that weird little middle ground. I know. Ben knew I was gonna say that. Yeah. They were open in that weird little middle ground of the 90s where not a lot of breweries survived. So they get forgotten. They're not, they're not the Gearys and they're not the new wave. They're kind of stuck in the middle. but man, do they make some great beer.
Yeah.
So they kind of went off a brew pub model after. So they had a production facility, they still do. And then, in the 90s, they made different brew pubs in different areas that were carrying the beer. So it was kind of that model where you have a single production facility, but then multiple brew pub locations. And there used to be a brew pub location in just straight up downtown Portland that has unfortunately closed because they're focusing on, they've basically made their headquarters in Gorham. Now they're like central place. So like it's a tasting room. It's got a pizza thing in it. Like it's whole thing. So they're kind of focusing towards that. They still have a couple of the satellite locations open, but that one in downtown Portland isn't there anymore. But the beer in general is in my fridge all the time.
Yeah.
It's just really solid. It's easy drinking. It's consistent. They have a beer called Fries Leap, which is just another one of those IPAs that just, it's what you think of when you think of an IPA, and it's just delicious. It just hits the spot whenever you need it. And they do some, periodically other releases. They do a barley wine that's really good. They do, but typically it's really their core lineup that really ends up, the summer beer is in my fridge all summer. Fries Leap is year round. They have Slick Nick, which is a winter kind of focused beer, but it's not a dark beer. It's delicious. They're doing it right. And to me, it's like an unfortunate thing of timing where nobody mentions them in the same breath as the history or the new stuff.
Yeah.
So I always have to give them a little bit of a shout out. So that's the beer that if you're coming up to Maine for a vacation, you buy that at the grocery store and bring it with you to camp. Like that's the beer that you take.
I'm 100% with you. And I'm so glad that you raised Sebago. I'm a big fan, have been for a long time. They've been open since 98. And one of the co-founders, Kai Adams, is this ball of energy. Obviously, he's been at this for, like 25 years now, but he sort of looks like a kid still. And the first time I ever met him when I was doing the book, I stopped by Sebago, and he was taking me on the tour, and he said, "You ever been to the top of a grain silo?" And then he just started tearing up. He just got this new grain silo. He started tearing up the ladder to the grain silo. I followed him about halfway up, looked down about 30 feet, and I said, "F this, I'm out." He is a character, but their beers are not ones that are necessarily going to blow beer geeks away and people who are looking for the next new thing. But man, are these solid, drinkable beers that, as Carla said, you buy these in a 12-pack or something, and you are going to be so happy you did. And you're going to be on your third one, and you're going to be like, this is just good, solid beer. At. Yeah, I think for this category, this question, that is the place
that's the answer.
That is the answer.
I will ask Ben, what's our nickname for Kai?
Which one? So Kai is a verb, by the way.
Kai is a verb. You got Kai'd. And then also we've referred to him as the Kai-nado because Kai-nado. So like he'll be at an event and he will wrap everybody up into wherever everyone is going after that event, it's just always a good time.
Yeah, it's this beer scene is fantastic for those reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, when there's the Kai-nado, you get Kai-napped. We come up with like 5 different verbs that Kai would do.
Yeah.
And to your point though, before you said beer geeks may not. I think if beer geeks went to their tasting room, they actually do have a lot of single batch beers that they brew out of their tasting room. Half their tap line in the tasting room is not what you can get on the shelves, and those can tickle a beer geek's interest quite well, I think.
It has been a few years since I've been there, and now I'm excited to get back. Every time I'm in Maine, I drink some of Sebago's beer, but it has been a while since I've been there. So
there's another reason to come up here. So
never need an excuse. But before we kind of close up shop here, I have one or two more questions for you. But we'll start with Ben here. Basically, if you had just kind of one evening, and you had folks coming in from out of town, and you could maybe go to just 2 or 3 places. Where are you starting, and how's the rest of your evening going?
Ooh, okay. Let's have them experience all of Maine's beverages, I would say, in general.
Okay.
I would say in the beginning, you can wake up, go to Marcy's Diner. That's a great place. They have actual beer now, and they have different flavored mimosas. So that's a great place to sort of start the day drinking. Probably lunch at Bissell Brothers. They have a great kitchen, good history of Maine beer there. I'd say, every night that I take somebody out, it's always going to end at Navarre. So that's just the end point. But this is what happens in between that, basically. I think Après is a nice place to sort of show people where Portland's going. It's a nice, uh, it's a hard seltzery. It's a brewery that makes hard seltzers basically exclusively, and some ciders, and they are really flavorful and they rotate their flavors quite a bit. The vibe is very like almost bougie inside, very upscale, nice, but approachable, and that's a really nice spot. And when you get there, you're kind of in the middle of that East Bay side where you can jump from brewery to brewery or go to 3 of Strong. So then you can sort of play it by ear, see what kind of beers they're into, and they could go to whatever brewery within, there's 10 breweries within 2 blocks of that space. And then I would mosey my way for dinner up to probably Great Lost Bear, have a couple sausages, maybe GLB, Thirsty Pig, and maybe you can go to GLB and then Thirsty Pig because they you can probably as your day drinking keep eating at both places. And then obviously edit Navarre whenever they feel like just going to their final destination. Like I can go to Navarre at 5 and close it out because it's a place you can hang out at for a long time.
Yeah.
Carla, I'll ask you the same question. If you had an evening out, where are you taking folks? And also, why does it end with karaoke?
Yeah, because you're with me. That's why it ends with karaoke. Yeah. So I tend to, kind of think about, I tend to narrow this down for people before I go. Like, are you a happy person? Are you not a happy person? But if I wanted to give people like a real good spectrum of everything, probably for like lunch, like the kind of food and beer situation, I'd probably either opt for High Roller Lobster or Foul Mouth Brewing, which is just in South Portland. Really good food, little cozy environment, good variety, but also just nice comfort food, like gives you a good base for the rest of the day. And then you kind of really have the choice of, do I go up to the Industrial Way area or do I go to basically that East Bayside type area? And when I'm like walking around with people, if it's not there for like the purpose of trying as many beers as possible, I usually opt for East Bayside because there's really a variety of styles down there and it's close to food. Industrial Way is one weakness is that you can't like walk to a restaurant from there.
Yeah.
Whereas East Bayside, you could go to Rising Tide, where they have a really great spectrum of beer. Maybe you're getting a West Coast IPA there. Then you could walk around the corner to Bellflower, try some of their hazies or try some of that Baltic Porter that they've got on. And then you can go up the hill and Oxbow's got excellent sours on, and they've got, and that little strip right there, that street has a whole bunch of restaurants on it, that you could go for food. They've also got, distillers up there. They've got an oyster bar. Like it can be kind of a nice, like touch point. Usually I end up at Navarre, if I'm bringing a beer person out, and that's not that far from 2 places that do karaoke. So that's why there's now 2. So there's one that I go to that only does it once a week, but there's another bar that is actually near where Sebago's old place used to be that does it every night. So it's kind of like, it's easy to drag somebody down there because it's like, oh, it's a Tuesday. It doesn't matter. Let's go sing. So, but it's kind of amazing because like I have some friends that are like total hopheads. I have some friends that like only drink dark beer, and I have some, like they have very specific styles, and I could bring them to 5 or 6 places to satisfy those styles. And I feel like really grateful to be in the middle of that instead of just being, okay, we have 15 breweries and they're all brewing the same thing. They're all doing really unique things. And I think that's one of the coolest things about Portland, Maine.
Ben, Carla, I want to thank both of you for coming on. This has been a real deep dive into Portland, its history, its current situation. It's such a fantastic beer city. If people need a great vacation destination, it's fantastic in the winter. It's amazing in the summer. It can be a little bit crowded with tourists, but it stacks up. We didn't even get into the dining scene, even hardly. It's beautiful. It's on the water. It's got a lot of heritage. It's a fantastic city to visit. But we'll start with Ben. Where can people find you online and your work?
They can find me on Instagram at Active Beer Geek. Same thing with Twitter. Same thing with pretty much everything else. Active Beer Geek is my handle for a lot of things.
And Carla, how about me on? Yes, thank you for coming on. Carla, how about yourself?
I'm probably most reachable on Twitter. I'm at Beer Babe on Twitter. I was not lucky enough to get at Beer Babe on all of the other platforms, so please please do not confuse those folks with me. My beer related handle on Instagram is at Carla Jean Lauter. But I'm definitely, as long as Twitter exists, I don't know how much longer Twitter is going to exist as a place, but that's where I'm chatting up most beer. And then I write a monthly column for Beer and Weed magazine, which is a print magazine that is available for subscription anywhere you want, but also is kind of distributed to local establishments too. So pick that up if you're in town. It's kind of a more mature look at the beer and weed scene, as opposed to that kind of, college focused,
Mhm.
let's get stoned kind of perspective. So it's kind of it's a really neat take on both the marijuana industry and the beer industry in Maine.
Carla, Ben, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Beer Travelers podcast. If you have a suggestion for a town we should visit next, please drop us a line at podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Please give our podcast a review wherever you listen. It really helps folks find out about us. And if you like the episode, tell a friend and post on your socials. Interested in learning more about connecting with an engaged, energetic, and interested audience of curious beer consumers and brewers? We have many different advertising opportunities, including through our podcasts, website, newsletter, and social media channels. For more information, please contact us at podcast@allaboutbeer.com. All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts. My pick for a place to have a beer in Portland, Maine, is the Basement Bar at Gritty McDuff's. From its popular 4th Street location, just steps from the cobblestones of Wharf Street, Gritty's is both a mainstay on the Maine brewing scene and an anchor in Portland's historic Old Port district. When it opened in 1988, Gritty's became Maine's first brew pub since Prohibition, and was an early pioneer in the state's craft brewing movement. Gritty's focus on cask beer and English styles, which are certainly not in the modern favor. But the basement bar during a snowy day or night in the winter, where you can just look out into the falling flakes, is perfection. I'd recommend a Best Bitter or a Black Fly Stout.